Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Okay, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast, the podcast about adventurous people for adventurous people. And today I've got the privilege of having a chat with Fiona Quinn. Hi, Fiona.
Hi.
So a bit of a brief how I got introduced to Fiona, I suppose, was it was actually from a Facebook ad advertising her new book, is how I sort of came to know about her. So her book was Ignore the Fear, a woman's paddleboarding adventure from Land's End to John O'Groats with a fear of the sea. And I thought that sounds like an interesting read. So I bought a copy, read it over a weekend, really enjoyed it, and then got in touch with Fiona to see if she'd come onto this podcast and tell us all about that adventure. So where on earth did the challenge come from, Fiona, bearing in mind you're scared of the sea, to paddleboard from Land's End to John O'Groats? Yeah,
it sounds like a bit of a crazy idea, doesn't it, really? I guess... So the fear itself comes from when I was a child. So I nearly drowned in a swimming pool. But the lifeguards didn't actually see me. So I ended up rescuing myself, as it were. So I pulled myself out. So ever since then, I've been fine in swimming pools because I know I can save myself. But out at sea, I just don't, I just feel so scared and so vulnerable. That's kind of where the fear itself comes from. And then the idea of paddleboarding Land's End John O'Groats really started way back. Couple of years before I did it in 2018. When I first sort of got into adventure, really, was on my bike. I set out to cycle Land's End John O'Groats. I actually failed the first time, so I went back and did it again. Cycled the whole way successfully the second time. I then walked John O'Groats to Land's End, and then it just kind of felt like the obvious next step, what any normal person would do, would turn it into a triathlon. So that's kind of where the water-based element of it came from. And then because of the fear, there was no way I was going to swim it. So paddleboarding seems like a way that I could cope with the fear, but still go out and have an adventure.
Yeah, because you started off pretty much in London with no real adventure in your life. And you kind of came across adventure in being active and getting in the great outdoors, didn't you?
I did, yeah. So I was just working mainly a research job and running my own businesses and things in London in my 20s. And then my boyfriend at the time was really into cycling. So then I got a bike on the Cycle to Work scheme. And it was kind of from there that I started meeting people in the adventure world, going on micro adventures. So camping out just one night under the stars. And then it just kind of got bigger and bigger. And I did sort of cycling London to Brighton, London to Cambridge, wanted to do my own challenges. So the first one that I really made up was a much smaller triathlon along the River Cam. So it's near where I grew up in Saffron Walden. And I just went source to sea along the River Cam. I walked the whole length, cycled the whole length, and then stand-up paddleboarded the navigable bit in the middle. And then it was from there that I sort of progressed to Land's End John O'Groats, really.
I think the biggest surprise for me reading the book, and obviously you go into talking about the walk Land's End to John O'Groats, the cycle, was really how little training you've ever done for any of your challenges. You've kind of just come up with a challenge and gone, I'm going to do that. And then you just sort of get fit as you go along because, especially from the paddleboarding, you were never a paddleboarder. You were scared of the sea. And then you just went and did day after day after day of paddleboarding. So did you find that hard in terms of all of your challenges of doing no training? Or do you think as the challenge went on, you just naturally got fitter and it got easier for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd never considered myself sporty. So I've never done organized sport, really. I've never going to the gym. So the idea of training for something to me just sounded like awful. Like, how boring would that be? So I just really wanted to go and enjoy the adventure. And I wasn't trying to go for times. I wasn't trying to beat anybody's record. It was just really about me and my own pace. And as you say, I just get fit along the way. So for none of the challenges really I trained at all. But the paddleboarding one, I guess, was different in that it was definitely more of a mental challenge than a physical one. I mean, from a physical perspective, I couldn't paddle all day. I could only paddle 6 hours at a time with the tide that was pushing me north. There was absolutely no point in trying to paddle against the tide. So physically, I was kind of quite limited to how much I could be on the water. mentally it was the challenge of, can I face this fear? And to make sure that I didn't scare myself out of going, I only paddleboarded on the sea 3 times before I left, probably totaling less than an hour. So yeah, very, very inexperienced before I left.
So with regards to such a big challenge then, obviously the Land's End to John O'Groats, the cycling and the walking one, they were just independent. You did those on your own. Then you get to the paddleboarding one, and obviously there's no way you can go and do that on your own, unsupported. You need a support team. You need a crew. There's loads more planning involved. So do you want to talk us through how you coped with the logistics of actually that trip? Because it's not I'm going to do that next week sort of trip, is it? That's going to take some serious planning.
So it took me about five or so months of planning. So I guess the things that were involved, as you mentioned, team. So previously I've gone solo and self-supported, and for this one, I needed a support boat, so I needed a skipper. I ended up having a deckhand as well. I wanted a photographer to kind of document the trip. It's sort of hard to take selfies of yourself when you're on a paddleboard. And then also I needed to source a boat. I needed to try and find finance to fund it all. And then sort of looking at, well, what route am I going to go? Do I go in the canals, or do I go over the Irish Sea? And then there was dealing with the weather along the way and the tides, and kind of, thinking about to what degree of weather am I comfortable going out in, and how will that affect our progress and all that kind of stuff. So there was quite a lot involved. And I actually really liked that. I liked bringing everything together and kind of having this idea and making it happen. And it definitely wasn't an easy process. I actually started at Land's End without pretty much having any of that stuff in place. So I had found a boat that I wanted. It was actually cheaper to buy a boat than to rent one. But I hadn't bought it at that point when I started at Land's End. So I had to hire a boat just for a couple of days with a hired skipper, because I hadn't managed to find a skipper yet. All I'd had so far was really my photographer, Liam, who was 22. Luckily, he was a paddleboard instructor. And he was also a motorboat and a dinghy instructor. So while he'd never really been on a yacht before, he had some water-based experience. So I set off from Land's End, did 2 days paddling, then had 2 weeks of bad weather, which was actually pretty handy, because during that time I managed to buy a boat, get some funding, and then Liam ended up becoming my skipper. So it kind of, I just kept pushing, and then eventually it all fell into place.
Yeah, I think that was my favourite part of the book, really, was seeing your relationship with Liam evolve from the start to the finish of all of this. This young lad was coming into this adventure to basically expand his videography and photography portfolio. And next minute, I would say he pretty much pulled the expedition together for you in terms of like it actually being able to happen. And he was your skipper in the end, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have got to the end without him. And it was very different to what he expected. He thought he'd be sunning himself on the back of a yacht taking a few pictures. And there was an awful lot of responsibility that he took on. He was, for a lot of it, the only person on my support boat while I was on the sea paddling. And we would have to motor to and from harbour at the end and beginning of each paddle. So there was a lot of work involved for him. But, he also got to learn an awful a lot along the way. He'd never skippered a yacht before. So I managed to find a guy that would teach him for a couple of days at the beginning. And then he got to pretty much skipper a yacht the length of Britain. So it was an incredible experience for him. And I think he absolutely loved it, even though it was tough for both of us at times.
Yeah, I suppose, on all your previous trips before, you've been on your own. Your boat wasn't the biggest of yachts in terms of, so the two of you on a little yacht living on it the whole time, when you've just met this person as well, it must have been kind of learning everything about each other at that point.
It was very intense, and it was a very good way of getting to know someone very quickly. But I think, it just worked really well. And I think that's actually a really kind of key point in terms of bringing people onto it, particularly in an expedition team, where it is very intense. At times it's kind of sort of life or death situations, they can be sometimes. And so bringing people onto the team, you really want to make sure that they're of a similar mindset, no matter what their role is initially and how that might develop. And I was very lucky that Liam and I saw sort of eye to eye quite a lot. And we learned quite early on, like when each other needed some space, and we were just kind of paddle and sail quite far away on the water, or like when we get in harbour, we just each go for a run our separate ways or whatever. But then also just spending our downtime together, getting to know each other, going for food, all this kind of stuff was just really nice to spend time with him.
What made you choose your route then? Because obviously because you were, when you first came up with this challenge, no other female had done it. So
no
it was
other person had done it.
No other person had done it.
No.
And then whilst you were setting up, just about to start, you received an email, didn't you, from somebody else?
Yes, yeah. So Cal decided that she would do it at the same time as me. She's an incredibly experienced paddleboarder. I think she was ranked 5th or 3rd in Britain or something at the time, in the paddleboarding league that there is. So yeah, she was like the complete opposite of me. Like, I'm an amateur, I'm scared, whereas for her, this is her home. And so her route took her in the canals. So she went in through the Bristol Channel, through the canals, and then our routes joined up through Scotland as we both went through the Caledonian Canal. But right at the beginning, when I started planning, so I know Sean Conway, so he swam the length of Britain, and I was very much using him as a guide. He was incredibly helpful, and his route took him over the Irish Sea. And the island is actually a much better coast to go up rather than Wales. It's much more direct. It's more sheltered from the weather. So yeah, that's basically why I chose my route, and she chose a different one.
Yeah, because you having a yacht that you've got to moor up, you do have to consider your route and where you're going to stop and be able to stop and get your boat into a mooring at the same time, don't you? So was that another reason why Ireland was popular for you, because you could actually make those stops each day en route?
I mean, there are more harbours on the east coast of Ireland versus the Welsh coast, but predominantly it was a weather and distance thing. And also, I just wanted to go to Ireland. I thought it would be quite cool to go and explore Ireland. So they were the main reasons I chose Ireland, to be honest.
And in terms of, like you said, just before the trip, you had done an hour out in the water on a paddleboard. You had then gone up the coastline from Land's End, up through Cornwall, Devon, up past our doorstep, almost where we're based. And then you went across the Bristol Channel to the south of Wales. How was that compared to then having to leave land to go across to Ireland?
Yeah, it was interesting, actually. I think for me, initially, I'd never really considered the Irish Sea crossing as being any different to the rest of it. I was like, I'm just going to be paddling for a little bit longer that day. Like, it'll be fine. My support boat's there. When I did the Irish crossing, both that first one over from Wales to Ireland and then back from Ireland over to Scotland, we had a yacht master skipper with us. And I was very sort of adamant on that. Like, Liam would not be on his own with me when we're going over the Irish Sea. And yeah, so initially I didn't really see it as being kind of any different. But then just before I was about to leave, one of my sponsors, they were like, oh, did you know there are something like 30 species of whale and 10 species of shark in the Irish Sea? I'm like, thanks. Just make the fear even more just before I'm about to go. So I think as it got closer, and certainly the day before, I was really starting to feel the fear. The day before I left, I got off the water crying, like the weather conditions were super choppy and I just felt like I was going to fall off my board that day. But then luckily the day that I actually went across the Irish Sea, it just completely calmed down. The weather, it was like glass like the whole way, which is unheard of in the Irish Sea. So the actual day itself was much easier than it could have been. And I was incredibly lucky with the weather.
If you had to pick one day out of the whole trip, or one story out of the whole trip that you tell, which one would it be?
Invariably, it's the whirlpool story, which you might have guessed from reading the book. So this happened, for those of you that don't know it, there's a whirlpool called Corryvreckan, which is on the west coast of Scotland. And it's the world's 3rd largest whirlpool. So there was actually an experiment done, and I think it was a production company got a life-size dummy with a life jacket and a depth gauge, threw it into the whirlpool, and it got pulled 262 meters down to the seafloor. dragged along the seabed and chucked out further down current. So it's definitely a deadly whirlpool. Like if I'd been pulled in there, it would have been game over likely. And this particular day, we were trying to go a little bit faster on the water. And my support boat needed to go and do a refuel for the boat. And one of our crew was going to swap out for a new crew member. So they were going to go and do that in a harbour nearby. So we were kind of in the Scottish Isles at this point. We weren't sort of out on the edge near the sea. So they decided to leave me. I'd paddle on the water on my own, plan being to stay well away from the whirlpool, and they would then come back out of harbour and meet me on the sea and pick me up. So that was the plan. It was a very calm day, like glassy water, nice and sunny, not a breath of wind. So I paddled off. I was feeling quite comfortable at this point. But then I kind of realised that I was being pulled in the direction of Corryvreckan, and all the water around me started to get really swirly and would kind of throw my board around, and I was really starting to get worried that I was going to be thrown off my board. But I couldn't fight it. There was some small islands in the middle of the channel, but I couldn't get to those islands to beach my board. All I could do was just paddle against the tide to try and stay where I was. Meanwhile, my crew had come out of the harbour, but they couldn't find me. I wasn't where they expected me to be. So I texted my skipper and just said, like, please hurry, the tide's really strong. And then he rang me, and I answered the phone in probably the worst way possible. If you've lost someone and there's an increasing possibility that they're being pulled towards a deadly whirlpool. And I just answered the phone, like crying my heart out. I was so scared. I was like, where are you? I'm being pulled towards a whirlpool. I'm going to die. I was a little bit dramatic. And then 30 seconds into that phone call, like all the water around me just shifted again. And it just sort of moved into this one big circle, and I was in the middle of it. And I knew that other whirlpools developed at different tide states, and they wouldn't get as big as Corryvreckan, but I didn't know how big they'd get and what kind of impact that would have on my board. So I just had to hang up on my skipper after I sort of told him what I could see, and then just paddled like crazy to get to the edge of this whirlpool. And eventually I got to a little bit of slack water, and I spotted my boat, and they'd seen me, and they came and scooped me out of the water, and it was kind of all okay in the end. But it was a little bit hairy. And it just reminded me to, like, you know, why was I doing this adventure? I was doing it for the cake stops and just to kind of go at my own pace, but we'd kind of tried to quicken our pace a little bit for one of my sponsors, and that wasn't the thing that I should have done. I should have just stuck to my own goals and my own guns, I think, and done it my way.
And did you have pressure from sponsors then? Because obviously there were two of you, you know, competing, although you weren't really competing to be the first person to do it. But were your sponsors sort of pushing you in that direction for you to be the first?
I think it's interesting because I wasn't competing at all. Like when I sort of announced in the December before that I was going to do this, no one else had done it before, man or woman. I just wanted to go at my own pace, face my fear in my own way, and just get to the end. But I think from what I understand, Cal was very keen to go very quickly, and she did get there before me. Most of my sponsors, well, all of them bar one, didn't care how long it took me to get there. They were just there for the story. And, you know, me as an amateur, terrified, is a very different story to Cal as a pro, just smashing out and getting to the end. So really, it was just only the one that was very keen for me to go quickly. So I didn't really, you know, this is what they signed up to. And I think they were very happy with the story in the end.
Yeah, perfect. I think there's two stories in the book that are my favourites. I think the first story is when you woke up on the morning when you had moored just off Lundy Island. I think that was, obviously with Lundy just being across the water from where we're based here, that was kind of talking about, you know, where we are. So I kind of enjoyed that one. And then the other one was your deckhand who took over the boat in the canals in Scotland.
Oh yeah, Aileen. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. How you know, this person had never even, she couldn't even drive a car, never driven a boat before, and you were kind of like, we could just get a little way along here, and then and you just missed the other boat as you were reversing backwards
because the wind tried to blow us into one of the other boats. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I really loved about this expedition, really, and having crew on board was that I could give other people the opportunity to have their own first as well. It wasn't just about me and my first of, you know, paddleboarding length of Britain. It was about them, and like Liam skippering for the first time, and Aileen being on a boat for the first time, driving a boat for the first time. She'd never paddleboarded before either. Like, it was brilliant to be able to give these people experiences as well.
Yeah. So when you finally finished then, did you then, obviously the boat was then in Scotland. How did you sell the boat in the end? Have you still got the boat? Did you bring it back down to Devon to sell it, or how did it all end once you had completed it?
Yeah, so John, who was our yachtmaster skipper for both the Irish crossings, he came back and he skippered it with me. We took it down to Bristol. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog barking.
That's right. We can hear your dog. It's fine.
So John came and we skippered the boat back down to Portishead near Bristol, and I lived on it for a month, and then I managed to sell it on to a chap called Alan, who the year before I paddleboarded, he tried to swim a length of island, failed because his support boat partly sank. So then he was looking for a really reliable one, bought my one, and then successfully swam the length of island the next year. So she went on to have other adventures. I think that's
really important, isn't it? Is looking at all your options as well for any trip. And when we're talking about like the trips that we do, everyone says to us, do I hire it, or, do I buy it when it comes to kit? But actually, did you lose much money on the boat, or was it just a transaction in the end?
No, I broke even on the boat. So yeah, got my money back. So it was a free boat, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So, there you are thinking, how am I going to do this? All right, you had to stump the money up in the first place. But actually, in the long run, it saved you a fortune because you didn't have to hire a boat. And I think that's the same, when anyone's doing an adventure, there are so many places now that you can hire your kit from, but you can also sell your kit really easily as well. So if you are buying things, everything, if it's well looked after, things have that retail value to then sell on again. So, you shouldn't think about, I'll hire it because it will save me money. Actually, you get your money back.
Yeah, you can do, absolutely. There's always lots of options.
What was the one piece of kit that you're glad you took with you on the trip?
Probably my life jacket, because I'm so scared. It's crucial, and I think anyone really, if you're going on the sea, should have a life jacket. It just makes sense. But also, it has really handy pockets in it for cake and for, chocolate bars and stuff, which was the whole point of the adventure for me, is the cake stops. So I think that was crucial.
And is there a piece of kit now that you wish you'd known about when you did the trip that you wish you'd taken with you?
Ooh, I don't think so. I mean, I guess from a safety perspective, the only thing I'd probably change in terms of the kit that I had on me was I'd go for like a waist leash rather than an ankle one. I just think if you do get into a situation where you need to pull your leash off, it's much easier to get it off on a waist leash. But other than that, I think I was, pretty happy with all the kit I had. All the stuff performed really well. The board, the waterproof bags I was using, all the bits and pieces were great.
Brilliant. And that's the same with any trip, isn't it? If you've planned it properly, you've got the kit that you need for that trip. And sometimes it's better to buy better kit because you're going to be using it all the time in that situation. We have that conversation with some of our people who are on our trips all the time. And, there are much cheaper ways of doing it, but you could be replacing your kit, or it could be breaking a lot more than you want it to. So you've finished that challenge.
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on the...
Carry on. We had a bit of a delay there.
Sorry, I think the connection's gone a bit funny. I was just going to say, I think it depends on the trip, like in terms of your kit. So can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I think it depends on the kind of trip that you're doing in terms of the kit. So when I was on the water, obviously like safety was super important. So I wanted to have the absolute best kit. But when I was like doing the bike ride, for example, I borrowed loads of kit from friends. And sometimes my bike would break along the way, and I knew that there were bike places where I could get it fixed. So I think it can be a balance between depending on the kind of adventure that you're doing, whether you have super good kit and you really, really need that, or whether you can just go on a much easier trip and borrow some bits and make it much more accessible.
Yeah, definitely. So you finished that challenge. You've done your triathlon. What's next for Fiona Quinn then? What's your next challenge that you're working towards now?
Yeah, so I've got quite an exciting one coming up this year, actually. So I've never considered myself a runner, and I like to do things that I've never done before. So I decided that I'm going to, over the sort of the next 4 or 5 months or so, train for the first time and see if I can run an ultra marathon. So basically go from my couch, essentially. I've never run more than 5 miles, to doing what is considered Britain's toughest ultra marathon, which is the Pennine Way. So it's 260 miles along the spine of England, and I'll be doing it non-stop, so 10 back-to-back marathons, running throughout the night, day after day. So I'll hopefully do that sometime in the summer this year.
And what else is on your bucket list? Obviously, this is the Bucket List podcast, so we do ask people, what is on your bucket list to achieve?
Yeah, so I'd love to explore a bit more of Ireland. Other than paddleboarding the length of the East Coast, I've not really explored Ireland. So I'd love to go and sort of wander around Ireland a bit more. But also maybe go down to the Mediterranean and some slightly warmer climates and do some paddleboarding down there maybe and explore a bit further. I think they're kind of my next on my list to do. And
do you want to just tell everyone about, because you run a book club as well, don't you? And I think it would be really interesting for our listeners, because a lot of our listeners are on trips all the time, they're on aeroplanes all the time, they've got a lot of spare time, and I think it could be really interesting for them to be part of your book club, because actually they've got the time to read the books.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called, very unimaginatively, it's called Adventure Book Club. And we read a different adventure book every month. It's completely free to join. You can just follow us on Instagram or sign up to the newsletter. And our books range completely from sort of local British adventure kind of stories to bigger ones around the world, all sorts of different sports. We've had free diving and skiing around the world, running around the world, loads of kind of different things. But we also throw in some other books in there, sort of mindset type books. So our book this month is called In Praise of Slow. So it's kind of, which I think is quite nice for adventure. Sometimes people try and rush and kind of beat records or whatever, but actually it's quite nice to go a bit slower and have a different perspective on life. So we read a whole variety of different things.
Brilliant. Well, I'll add a link to that into the show notes for the podcast so anyone can click in and find that out. Where else can people find out about you, Fiona, and what you're doing?
So I'm on the major social channels at Fiona L. Quinn, and then my website is just fionalquinn.com.
Brilliant. And I assume people can go onto your website and buy your book as well?
They can indeed. Yeah, it's there.
It's definitely a good one to read. I really enjoyed it. Well, thanks ever so much for coming on and having a chat with us today, Fiona, about your adventure. It's been really interesting. Like I say, I really enjoyed the book. Living by the sea, kind of, it certainly, I really enjoyed the story. So thanks for coming on, and check out Fiona, everyone. Catch you later. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.